If they have two planters, they're going to hit both crops. But I think there is a shift maybe to planting soybeans a little earlier. And that's mostly because if you plant earlier, it may be less ideal conditions, maybe a little bit colder, a little bit wetter. And we know that soybeans are more resilient to that stress compared to corn.
We're talking about Ohio soybeans on the AgNow Roundup that starts right now. Well, good morning and welcome to the AgNow Roundup. My name is Dave Deken. If I say the two words planting date, a lot of producers across the country either think of corn or soybeans. This morning, we're taking a look at soybeans with Dr. Laura Lindsey, who is the soybean extension specialist with Ohio State University. And we'll be talking with her in just a couple of minutes. But first, let's take a look at the weather across the ag world with meteorologist Matt Makins.
Time for AgNow weather. Matt Makins here. Hope it finds you doing well. A drought situation has been constantly evolving. Obviously, it always does. Here, most recently, I'm growing more and more concerned with the Southwest and the South. From West Texas through New Mexico into parts of Arizona. Drought numbers are still there, not likely to budge very much. Same for some areas still around San Antonio, although their chances for rain will improve a little bit before we truly dry out this summer. Across the north, stretching down into corn country, down to the south even farther, this is another area of concern. If I fly this map in, we'll just kind of look at the Midwest, generally speaking. So Ohio, out toward Iowa, we have these pockets of drought, especially for parts of Iowa. This region obviously needs water, big growing area. We're almost into that growing season. Can we do enough work, if you will, on this drought situation before the growing season really takes off? Well, what do we need to do? We got to get water in the ground, obviously. That's priority number one. And the best way to do it this time of the year is some snow or soaking rains. Soil temperatures on this map, that region shown right here, these dots, those soil temperatures, they are above freezing. So that soil can hold moisture. If it rains, if it snows, it soaks in, penetrates pretty well. Different story North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and northern South Dakota for that matter. Still some frozen ground there, so adding water there is more of runoff than actual soil absorption. Favorably leaning toward soil that can pick up water. Let's see if over the next 7 to 10 days if we're grabbing some water. And there is going to be a system here in the short term that does move through that region. Provides quite a bit of water. We'll check precip totals in a moment. And then we're going to hit a lull this weekend. Kind of quiet for Saturday into Sunday. There's still going to be some activity for the west, and some of that activity will peel off of the west and try to move through, say, Colorado, gain a bit of traction in Kansas and Nebraska, drop a bit more precip around Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, into Ohio. And then late next week, so we're talking about the 15th, 16th, 17th, there's going to be another strong system to come through. It likely stays to the south of the Midwest, but it's going to be a good rain producer for parts of Texas, Oklahoma, and down into the Gulf Coast states. Now, in terms of total snowfall, this time of the year, I would prefer, I know everyone's opinions are different, but I would prefer a blanket of snow on the soils here that would slowly melt in. That would help the soil absorption, get that water in there a bit more efficiently than a quick rain. But be that as it may, just a little hint of snow possible in that region. Heavier snowfall into eastern Canada, the Maritimes, New England, and heavier snowfall totals out in the Rockies, with the exception of a couple of systems that are going to take snowfall, peel it off of the high country, and move into the high plains of Nebraska and Colorado, Wyoming, and right around the Raton Mesa too. So some of these prairies here, and there are also some farmable ground too, is going to pick up some water in the form of snow. And again, based on soil temperatures, when that melts, it should soak in fairly nicely. Total precip now, the west continues to see lots of water, although it is taming down a little bit for mid-March. The Colorado into New Mexico, mostly the Rocky region, and some out on the plains too. There's going to be some heavier precip. But for the south, the southeast, you see this big swath of moisture here. That's 2.5 to 3 inches, if not into the 3 to 4 inch category. But for areas here in the Midwest and the upper Midwest, Corn Belt region, Ohio Valley, let's fly that map in and kind of see where things end. For Iowa, the heaviest stuff is down to the south. Still, we're picking up valuable water. That's going to help the soil moisture situation. But most of I-70 and southward is where we have some of that heavier precip. As you move into Indiana, into sections of Ohio, a lot of these regions here, these purple shades, you're moving from an inch to an inch and a quarter to an inch and a half or so. That's good water. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's nice to have that. And again, for this area, it's mostly going to be in the form of rain, although a little bit of frozen precip will be possible, but mostly in the form of rain. Where do we go beyond this? This is going to be the 14th to the 20th of the month. Just generally speaking, where are the warm regions versus cold? Well, you can see warm regions painted in the reds here. That's the vast majority of North America. Some colder pockets from Mexico into southeast. What about moisture during this period? It's the time of year where if you had a lot of warmth, you're likely to be dry at the same time, sadly. So we're going to be drier than average for the west, drier than average, kind of focused right on the boot heel of Missouri, central Mississippi and southward. There's going to be some moisture in parts of the upper Midwest, Great Lakes region, and throughout Texas on up into Colorado. But by and large, this next week, so the 14th through the 20th, we're going to be looking at drier than normal conditions for a lot of us and warmer than normal conditions for the vast majority of us. That's this week's AgNow weather report. We'll have another check in about a week or so. Hopefully this gets you up to speed on some of the details headed your way.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. Whenever you talk about soybean production across the country, you talk with producers in nearly 30 states, all the way from the southeast up to the north central parts of the Great Plains. This morning, we're taking a look at one of the top producing soybean states of Ohio, because soybeans are in the top of the ag economy of the Buckeye State. And there's not a better person to talk about soybeans in the great state of Ohio than Dr. Laura Lindsey, who is Ohio State University's Soybean Extension Specialist. Dr. Lindsey, what makes Ohio a really great place for soybean production?
Yeah, so Ohio is a wonderful state for soybean production. We have very high yields in the state. We're kind of part of the corn belt, but I like to call it the soybean belt. We actually have more soybeans in Ohio than corn. So on average, we have about 5 million acres of soybean and about 3.5 million acres of corn. So soybeans are a very good crop to grow in the state of Ohio.
What questions do you get from soybean producers across not only Ohio, but maybe some of the neighboring states that come to you?
Yeah, so one of our most common questions and concerns are really surrounding planting date for soybean, because we have very limited field days in the spring. So we know the optimum planting window is probably between mid-April to mid-May, but looking at historical weather data, only about half of those days are suitable for field work. So that includes spraying, fertilizer, and planting. So we know sometimes people have to plant a little bit earlier than what they'd like or a little bit later because we have so many weather limitations in our state.
Well, and I guess that's kind of changed the approach from the producer standpoint too. The planters have probably gotten bigger so they can cover more land in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Cover as much land as you can and take advantage of a nice day. So I think that's what our growers have really learned. If you have good weather, you take advantage of it.
Now, I am asking the soybean specialist this, but every year, I mean, it comes down to, are we going to plant corn or are we going to plant soybeans first? In 24, what are you hearing from producers?
So that's really interesting and something I'm working on with our corn agronomist, Dr. Osler Ortez. We actually did some head-to-head comparisons of corn versus soybean last year. But in general, I feel like farmers are maybe shifting to prioritize soybean planting first if they don't have two planters. If they have two planters, they're going to hit both crops. But I think there is a shift maybe to planting soybeans a little earlier. And that's mostly because if you plant earlier, it may be less ideal conditions, maybe a little bit colder, a little bit wetter. And we know that soybeans are more resilient to that stress compared to corn. You want to plant corn when you have good conditions, you get nice, even emergence.
Whenever it comes to the soybean production, take me through the whole growing season. I mean, mid-April, that's your target time for planting, but But what do we look at from that time all the way through harvest?
Yeah, so ideal planting days can shift north to south, right? So maybe in the southern part, it'll be more like mid-April. It could be later in the more northern portion of the state. Some years we see extremely wet weather. One was 2019, where we almost had 0 soybeans planted in May, and it was shifted into June. The thing about soybeans is that they're resilient, and they still yielded okay for June. But planting is really important. And of course, as they go through the growing season, weed control, I'm not a weed specialist, but our weed control person gets extremely busy in May and June answering those questions. A lot of efforts at Ohio State with our plant pathologist looking at foliar diseases. So farmers are looking to make those decisions probably in mid-July, late July, whether or not they're going to spray a foliar fungicide for foliar diseases. They may throw in an insecticide. We don't usually need it in Ohio, but that's a common practice. And then if all goes well, we can harvest soybeans in, early October. Again, we get hit with wet weather on the front end and also on the back end. So sometimes we see some of those harvest delays as well in Ohio.
Whenever it comes to variety selection, I mean, I imagine that plays a major role in the success of a soybean crop. Without going into names or anything, what are some of the things that the producers are selecting for in Ohio?
Yeah, so a big one here is looking at disease resistance. Of course, yield is top. So when you're looking at a performance trial or company information yield, you want to pay attention to yield and select a high yielding variety that yields high in multiple locations. Right. But we also in Ohio, we encourage our producers to look at disease resistance. So we have both seedling diseases, so Phytophthora, and then also some areas of the state may have white mold issues. That's mostly Northeast Ohio. Frog eye leaf spot is another concern in some areas. So we encourage farmers to look at yield, of course, but also reflect on their fields and what diseases are problematic and try to select a variety that's also has a good disease resistant package.
I meant to ask this earlier, but with the large amount of moisture that you get at planting and then closer towards the harvest time of year, it really made me think of soil type, because a heavier clay, does certain things with the soil. What is kind of the soil type that Ohio producers are planting in or that they're looking for?
So it's again variable, but Ohio is also blessed with heavy clays in the northwest portion of the state. So not only do we experience these heavy rainfall events and a large amount of rain, we also have very heavy clay soils in several areas of the state, but northwest Ohio in particular. So those are very, very big and real challenges with farmers.
One thing that I love talking with research and extension folks about is the research that they're doing on the farm at the research stations and such. What are some of the areas that you and your colleagues in the soybean area are working on for the producers of Ohio?
Yeah, so my favorite project right now, we call it Battle for the Belt. It is the corn belt versus the soybean belt. And we actually bought a wrestling belt for the winning crop. But it goes back to your original question about planting priority. Do you prioritize corn first or soybean first? So we had our first year last year where we planted corn and soybean on the same day in adjacent fields, same soil type. 5 days or 5 different days. So we started mid-April and went into mid-June. So we could have head-to-head comparisons of how those two crops develop under the same weather conditions because they were planted the same day.
Wow. And who got the belt this last year?
Well, that's a great question. And this is like the typical agronomy answer of it depends, right? So Ohio is not a very big state, but we do have different growing environments. So in Northeast Ohio, I hate to say it, but corn may have won Northeast Ohio. Our best planting date in Northeast Ohio for both crops was May 11th last year. The problem, yeah, May 11th. And the problem with Corn is once you hit May 11th, yields decline very quickly. Soybean seeds yield declines as you plant later, but it's more subtle. Corn really drops off very quickly. Same thing in Northwest Ohio. The ideal planting date for both crops was about that mid-April planting date, but once you hit May 11th, corn just tanks in terms of yield, where soybean is more of a subtle, slight decline. The one location where soybean won hand down was our west central Ohio going towards Indiana, where the ideal corn planting date was June, which is not normal. Not normal, and it's not a recommendation, but it also shows the fact that weird things can happen, and we have these recommendations, and sometimes the opposite happens, right? So soybeans planted in mid-April at that location yielded on average 91 bushels.
Wow.
And we had our highest yield for mid-April. Corn highest yield, I think it was about 250 or so, was in June. But what happened was we were really, really wet early, extremely wet early, and cold. It was cold all the way through about mid-June, but we had a really long dry spell. And so the corn really suffered with the cold and wet and then pivoted to being dry very quickly. And there was very poor root growth. And so we saw floppy corn. And so the corn just didn't develop very well and flopped over. So the June was the best planting date for corn. I'm not recommending that to farmers in any way, shape, or form, but just kind of an interesting anomaly that happened last year.
Well, and your adjustments in the planting date study there really made me wonder. In certain parts of the country, primarily in the Great Plains, soybeans can be a double crop. Is that even an option in Ohio?
It is. So roughly, we have I-70 that goes to the center of our state. Roughly, that's the dividing line. If you're south of I-70, most people can double crop very comfortably. Some years, if wheat comes off early, the northern part of the state can double crop. There's double crop some years, if the price is right, all the way up in Northwest Ohio. And we've done some research up there. On average for double crops in Northwest Ohio, we can get about 20 bushels per acre. Some years it's higher, and some years it's a lot lower. And that's because soil moisture is limiting. It gets too dry. But the southern part, easy, can happen. Northern's a little bit more challenging depending on when that wheat is harvested.
I'm sure that you get references from other state specialists. What kind of questions do you have or do you get from someone saying, I go back to the Great Plains, but even the southeastern part of the United States?
Yeah, so I have wonderful colleagues in the southeastern part of the United States. So I'll give them a shout out that I don't get many of their grower questions because they do a fabulous job, but they're also answering the same questions that we are. So in Ohio, planting date is really important. In the southeastern part of the U.S., planting date is also important, but they're looking at it from other angles. It gets too hot very quickly, so they need to adjust their planting date or their relative maturities. Or on the harvest end, sometimes they have challenges with hurricanes and how to time harvest, because they know after a hurricane, seed quality can get extremely poor. So a lot of us across the U.S. are looking at exactly the same things based on farmer questions, but different angles because we have different problems in various areas of the states.
What advice would you have for that Ohio producer who said, I've been watching my neighbor go into soybeans. He's had great luck. I think I'm going to give it a shot this year. What advice would you have for that producer?
For soybeans?
Yes.
Yeah. Planting date is probably the number one practice that influences soybean yield. We also see that narrow rows are very important. So narrow for us would be 15-inch or 7.5-inch rows. 30, we can see some yield issues there. Variety selection, extremely important. Picking a high-yielding variety across multiple locations and knowing what disease package you need for your field. Those are probably, and then fertility, of course. We see if we have low soil fertility, pK, low pH, we can see issues with soybean as well.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lindsey, for going on with us and educating us about Ohio's soybean production.
Yeah, it was great being here. Thanks for the invitation.
And of course, thank you for watching this episode of the AgNow Roundup. If you'd like to learn more about production of soybeans in Ohio, check out our website, agnowtv.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email, sign up for the social media, and you can also download the AgNow TV app, which is also available on Roku and Apple TV. Download the app at agnowtv.com. From our farm to your farm, I'm Dave Deken for AgNow.